You see in every crisis, you see people in the worst conditions that we can imagine. I was in Gaza, where people are looking for their own homes using GPS because everything is flattened. I was in Myanmar and saw the Chinese rescue teams going in 24 hours a day after the earthquake to pull survivors from the rubble. And in all those situations, you feel the despair, but you also feel hope.
Tom Fletcher, UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, has built a global career spanning diplomacy, education, and humanitarian work. On his first visit to China in 15 years, he's prioritizing dialogue with Chinese media, and he joins us on the China Chat Show for an in-depth conversation.
In my job, you get to see the worst of humanity. You see what happens as a result of conflict and displacement and violence and brutality. But you also see the best of humanity. And ultimately, I think we have to hold on to that hope. I'm still idealistic overall, but I guess it's a more realistic idealism now.
The humanitarian system is actually under immense strain. So what would a meaningful humanitarian reset look like in your view?
We're underfunded and we're literally under attack. Last year was the deadliest year ever to be a humanitarian. Hundreds of humanitarian workers were killed, mainly in Gaza, but also in Ukraine and Sudan and elsewhere. And now we're facing brutal funding cuts, severe, deep, and very sudden. And people are dying because of those funding cuts.
So it's double kill.
It's exactly. And so we have to prioritize more clearly. We have to be more efficient. And then beyond that, I think humanitarian reset will mean that we do more of our work closer to the communities we serve.
What are the practical consequences of US aid cuts? Can this funding shortfall be addressed sustainably?
It's a big short-term challenge for us. Because of those cuts, we are closing massive amounts of programs. What we now need to see is other countries stepping forward. We'll also be continuing our engagement, our dialogue with Washington. These problems won't go away, and individual elections don't change the level of need.
Apart from funding shortfall, the other thing is the US tariffs.
Those tariffs risk an impact on the economies of the countries in which we work and where humanitarian needs are already great. There's also a risk that they have an impact on the economies of many of our partners and donors. So clearly we want dialogue, we want solidarity. We need a system of international solidarity and cooperation that builds dialogue and trust, that minimizes too many shocks and surprises.
As a proponent of multilateralism, how do you assess China's support for institutions like the UN and WHO, especially at a time when the US is retreating from international cooperation?
I don't believe that countries can really build extensive economic development by retreating from the world. I think they can only do it by engaging with the world, by building those partnerships in trust and dialogue in China's engagement with the world. It's not seeking to impose its view on others, it's seeking to build that dialogue and trust. And that's the spirit that I think we should all be cooperating in. We are in this more nationalist, transactional world, geopolitical context now. China speaks out very clearly and confidently at the Security Council about the importance of international humanitarian law, the structures that we've put around international cooperation. There is a growing confidence about China's role in the world and a growing commitment and a vocal commitment, which is very important, to the multilateral system.
China has also expanded its humanitarian contributions globally from emergency relief to peacekeeping. So how do you view this evolution?
It's a very important change. I think the world is looking for that partnership, not just on humanitarian support, but also in that effort to establish peace and security.
This year marks the 80th anniversary of the founding of the UN and of the victory in the world's anti-fascist war. So what key lessons from that era should we remember to prevent conflicts and uphold peace today?
So we learned in that period the cost of failure. If we fail to cooperate internationally, we have horrific, destructive conflict. The UN is not perfect, but we are the best idea the world has had for global coexistence. And the world has an interest in preserving that system, enhancing it, making it better. The UN is built to meet these global challenges: conflict, climate change, pandemics. But the UN is only as strong as the commitment to it from the member states. Even if some countries retreat from that international cooperation, that international order, that will reinforce for other countries the importance of coexistence, and that others will speak up even more clearly.
Your book, 10 Survival Skills for a World in Flux, urges us to rethink the future. So what kind of future do you envision, and also how essential is global cooperation in achieving it?
I look around the world and I see an age of distrust, of inequality, and of technological uncertainty. In many ways, the world is pulling apart at the moment, and we have to find ways to bring the world back together again, to focus on these common challenges that we face. Global cooperation is at the heart of this. I think we have two instincts as humans: one to compete for resource, and the other to work together for that resource and for a better world. And we see in history those instincts always competing, but ultimately we are stronger as humanity when we work together, when we work for coexistence.
And how do you see China's approach to diplomacy aligning with your vision or the UN's vision for the future?
So the UN at the moment is going through a huge reform program launched by the Secretary General called UN 80. And it's a chance for us to reform, to ensure that we are delivering for the people that we serve, that we are focused on our core values. And I think those align to a large extent with the initiatives that China has launched around peace and security, around global development, around cultural cooperation.
How do you think those initiatives are going to help and bring more stability and solutions to today's fractured world?
These are hugely important concepts because they talk about a sense of global solidarity, a sense of the world coming together and not pulling apart. They create those partnerships that we really need if we're to meet the challenges ahead of us. We also need that ingenuity and creativity and technological brainstorming that we can do together as a global community. And I see so much of that here in China. So for example, China is already using artificial intelligence to anticipate future climate shocks here in China. I believe we can use that work and in partnership to predict those climate shocks globally. And I think there's a great opportunity around Belt and Road, and so many of those projects have been impressive. I think, because the Kenyan president is here in Beijing this week, I'd highlight that the train from Nairobi to Mombasa and the development of the Mombasa port. I lived in Kenya for 4 years, and so I often drove that road. And in those days, in the late 1990s, the early 2000s, it was a very bumpy road, and it took us a long time to get from Nairobi to Mombasa. So to see those transport links shrinking the time and the distance between cities, I think has a huge impact on the global economy and on global development.
Are you looking forward to going back to Kenya and have a brand new experience with all the roads?
I'm very much looking forward to that. The fact that the infrastructure is improving means we can move humanitarian supplies much faster. Many of those countries in which China has that growing presence, that growing engagement, are also countries in which we need to build the humanitarian response.
You've visited China in various capacities. So what has stood out most from those encounters? And also, what would you like to say to those who have never been to China before?
One, the depth of the tradition and culture and history. The other striking thing here on this trip has really been more about the future compared to when I was here 15 years ago. Beijing is so green and the air is so much cleaner, and it shows how quickly a city can transform itself into a green city. And it's inspired me to think about how can we make the humanitarian movement more green? How can we look to China for leadership about how we bring more renewable energy, solar power, wind power into the humanitarian supply chains? I didn't stop believing in climate change just because of the results of a few elections recently. It is a huge threat to all of us, and I think Beijing is showing a different path. So my plan is to come many, many more times to to China in the role. It's been too long since the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs visited, and too long for me personally since my last visit. And I want to build up a relationship based on trust and dialogue and partnership. There is a real leadership role for China around the disaster response effort globally. I realized this when I saw those teams in Myanmar, but I also realized it when I visited the Ministry for Emergency Response Management, and to see the preparations that they have developed and the expertise of the Chinese first responders. I thought, the world needs this. We need that support from China and that leadership from China. I would like to see in the coming decade thousands of young Chinese humanitarians joining the humanitarian movement. I'd be very excited to recruit more Chinese talent to that effort.
Thank you so much.